Dirty Moderates, I want to welcome to the show today Jamie Kirchick. Jamie has done something that I don't think has been done before, has written a proper history of gay social history, I think, that is very illuminating about our political and social trajectory in this country in a really, really dazzling book that came out about a year ago. That I've just had the privilege to read. It's called Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. I learned a lot from this book I didn't know, and I'm so glad that Jamie is joining us today to talk about it and other things. By way of introduction, though, he's a columnist for Tablet. He's a writer at large. For Airmail, he's written widely in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. He has another book called The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. He knows his Cold War history. He's writing about Washington. He lives in Washington, and he is here. Jamie, good to have you.
Thank you, Adam.
So I guess the first takeaway, jumping into the book, I think so that listeners can understand when you say that there was a greater danger, an existential danger to being gay than there was to being a communist in Cold War era Washington. What does that mean? Let's talk about it.
Right. So our popular understanding in this country of homosexuality changed dramatically around World War II. Up until that point, homosexuality had been a sin. It was a crime in all 50 states, and it was a mental disorder. And gay people could be sent to mental hospitals and be lobotomized or chemically castrated, all these terrible things. World War II changes it, and then homosexuality becomes a national security threat. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because America overnight really goes from being an isolationist country to becoming a global superpower. And it has commitments all over the world. And there's this new idea of national security, which didn't really exist in America before then. And part of national security is secrets. You have to gather secret information on your adversaries. And the fear is that gay people, because they have this deep, dark, terrible secret themselves, that they are criminals, that they are sinners, that they are mental defectives, that they are therefore vessels for blackmail, that they can be blackmailed by our enemies, and in that case, in World War II, it was the Nazis. And so it's no coincidence that the first outing in American politics, right, the first forced disclosure of a political figure's hidden homosexuality, it occurs just a couple of months after World War II. It involves a senator from Massachusetts who was the chairman of the Naval Committee, David Walsh, and he was accused of being present at a male brothel in Brooklyn, near the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And the fear was that here was this gay man who had this terrible dark secret, and he's consorting with all these male prostitutes, and he's now vulnerable to being blackmailed by the Nazis. So that's what really makes homosexuality dangerous in a new way in America. And the reason why later on in the Cold War, it becomes more of a threat to someone's political career than even being a communist is that a communist could come out, so to speak, and become an ex-communist. And in fact, some of the most important leaders of the American conservative movement in the 1950s were former communists, were former Stalinists and Trotskyites. You couldn't do that if you were gay. You could not come out and say, "Oh, I was a gay person and I'm not anymore." That didn't exist back then. Once you were accused of being a homosexual, that was it for life. And we actually see this dichotomy that I just explained in the person of a man named Whittaker Chambers, who had been a courier in the communist underground in the 1930s. He was getting secret messages from government officials who were secret communists in the American government and State Department, and he was giving them to the Soviets. He was also living a gay life around the same time. He was hooking up with men, even though he was ostensibly straight. And what happens is, after the war in the late 1940s, he leaves. He's left by that point. He's left the Communist Party. He's actually become a very prominent conservative writer, an ex-communist. And he makes an accusation that a man named Alger Hiss, who was a very well-respected diplomat at the time, he was the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is one of the most prestigious think tanks in America. Chambers says that Alger Hiss was a communist spy in the State Department, and I know this because he was giving me secret documents and I was giving them to the Soviets. And Chambers, he's able to come out and say, I was a former communist, right? And that actually lends his accusations credibility. What he could not reveal publicly was that he had also been a homosexual. And the only reason we know that is because he told the FBI, because he was concerned that the Alger Hiss forces would try to out him, would try to expose him and discredit him by accusing him of having actually been pining for Hiss and being a spurned lover. And what Chambers refers to in his confession to the FBI, he says he prefaces it by saying, this is information that I could only share with a priest. Right, so he can come out as an ex-communist. He cannot come out as being an ex-homosexual, so to speak. And I would also say that, and there are other examples of this, of ways in which homosexuality was a more deadly, a more threatening accusation or charge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth, because this is such great history. Certainly, Richard Nixon helped establish his sort of red baiting bona fides by going after Hiss, famously, who turned out to be a spy. The establishment at the time decried any such notion and made light of it. When it turns out, we learned, right, when the archives were open, that he was a spy.
And in fact, separately, I think it might be interesting for your listeners. You can trace so much of conservative, to this day, conservative American distrust with institutions, with mainstream institutions, whether it be government, the deep state, the media. You can really trace it back to the Alger Hiss case, because Alger Hiss was a guy who was referred to as the Jeeves of the establishment. He was such a refined person. He went to all the right schools. He knew all the right people. They all defended him, right? And then it was exposed that he actually was a spy and that all these people had been duped. And so you can trace a lot of that conservative distrust of institutions to the Alger Hiss case.
Yeah, I mean, I've always argued that, the sort of savagery of McCarthy's tactics, I think, undermined an important time in Cold War history where, we really did have a mortal enemy in the threat of communism, and that was real. And we learned over time, and Applebaum obviously has written extensively about this going back to the 90s. But once we learned, it took a lot of leftists a long time to admit that Stalin had gulags, and that, and that this was not some toothless threat or toothless ideology that wasn't loaded with totalitarian implications. It was. And I think that became part of the whole, I think it's all part of the same stew. What I want to do, though, because you're a student of Cold War history, for those that don't know, Jamie went to Yale and studied or took a seminar with John Lewis Gaddis, who famously wrote a wonderful, really thrilling bio on the architect of our containment policy with the Soviet Union, George Kennan. To understand what it meant to be gay in Cold War era Washington, or even before, I think it's important that we get a little bit of a context of the Cold War, how America, and you write about this, really prior to 1945 really was much more of an isolationist country. I mean, we did not have this kind of national security apparatus that arose in the ashes of World War II. And that helps people understand, there was a lot of paranoia, but sort of why there would be communist panic, let alone gay panic. Can you give us like a little bit of a little primer on the Cold War? The OSS was the CIA's predecessor, things like that I think would help people understand what you illuminate so well in the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, America didn't have a civilian intelligence agency, the CIA,
right,
until World War II. It was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And there's that famous quote from the Secretary of State in the 1920s that gentlemen don't read each other's mail, and that was the attitude towards espionage. It was just something that wasn't really done, and that changes dramatically. And there's an anecdote I tell, came from a diary of FDR's naval aide, who was an admiral, and this was the late 1930s, so it was before the Second World War. And he's walking down the street near the White House, and he's passing the Corcoran Institute, which, if you know, Washington is just across the street from the White House. And the State Department at the time used to be in the building that is now the old executive office building. It's this giant sort of French-styled architectural style building next to the White House. That used to be the Department of State, War, and the Navy. And the naval aide, he saw a white piece of paper just flying through the air, and he snatched it out of the air and he looked at it, and it said, State Department confidential document. So it had literally flown out the window of the State Department. And that's how secrets were handled in Washington before World War II. And so it actually didn't come, there were a lot of people implicated in the Alger Hiss drama because, the Soviets were our allies in World War II, and there just weren't the same sort of security protocols that exist today, all these different departmental levels of top secret confidential information. It just didn't exist, right? And so there were a lot of secrets, quote unquote, being passed around in the years leading up to World War II, and then even in the early years of World War II itself. And it really gets more paranoid. It gets really more intense once the Cold War kicks in the late 1940s, because what you have is, America's victorious in World War II, but in those late years of the 1940s, there's a lot of setbacks to the West, right? We lose China, so to speak, to the communists. You have the Soviets imposing their will in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a coup in Czechoslovakia where the communists take power. They take power in Poland. All those countries come under the sway of the Soviets. And then combined with this is this understanding or this realization that homosexuals exist. So one of the first books that's published in the year 1948 is the Kinsey Report, which is the most famous study that's done on American male sexuality up until that point. And the most shocking figure from that is that 1 out of every 10 American men between the ages of 18 and 45 is homosexual. Basically, that's what this study finds. And that shocks people because up until that point, homosexuality was something that wasn't even really discussed at all. I mean, there would be euphemisms for it often. I mean, I mentioned earlier the first outing in American politics of Senator David Walsh from Massachusetts. The newspaper that outed him, the New York Post, the word homosexual did not appear once in its coverage of that scandal. They had all these other ways of describing it. He was found at a house of ill repute that only served men. There was a senator, the Senate Majority Leader referred to the accusation as a crime too loathsome to mention in the presence of ladies and gentlemen in the Senate. So that's how homosexuality was viewed. And then to have this report come out in 1948, right when the Cold War is really taking off. And it says that, that there's this secret identity, this secret group of people, these people who hide who they are. There's 1 out of every 10 men is one of these people. And that just it comes at the worst possible time because you have this paranoia about communism and you have this newfound paranoia about homosexuals, and the two identities become conflated, right? Because both of them can hide. Yep. The homosexual, it could be your school teacher. It could be the milkman. It could be the professor. It could be a high-ranking State Department official who's very well respected. Same with the communist, right? The communist meets in secret locations. You can't tell a communist just by spotting him on the street.
No.
So these two identities become very conflated in the public imagination. And then you have Joe McCarthy, who really does more than any other public figure to merge them in the public consciousness.
McCarthy, of course, whose chief counsel or aide was Roy Cohn, or one of his chief aides, who famously was gay and died of AIDS and swore he wasn't gay till his dying day. Was Joe McCarthy a closet homosexual? I mean, I sound like I'm interrogating you from the Senate. Was Joe McCarthy? I didn't mean it quite that way, but was he in the closet? I mean, we don't have enough evidence.
There were accusations made, but there was never substantiated evidence. Certainly, his enemmies tried to spread that rumor, and I have a whole chapter in my book devoted to the Army McCarthy hearings, which were the downfall of Joe McCarthy, and those hearings revolved around Roy Cohn's and Joe McCarthy's basically bullying of the Army to keep another staffer on the committee, a man named David Schein, who was the son of a hotel heir. And it was clear that Roy Cohn had a thing for him. Because basically what this entire scandal boiled down to was Roy Cohn was berating and bullying and pressuring Army officials to exempt Schein from his military service, which all men had to do well into the 1960s, right? And so you basically had this, you had Joe McCarthy's chief counsel on this committee was berating the military to keep his, wannabe boyfriend out of the military. And Joe McCarthy was allowing this to happen. And he wasn't telling Roy Cohn to quit it. And so you have a lot of journalists are speculating, what's going on here? Why is Roy Cohn so determined to keep David Schein out of the military? Why does Joe McCarthy allow his 26-year-old lawyer, embarrass him this way and get into trouble with the military? And there's actually a famous speech by a Vermont senator, a Republican, Ralph Flanders, who gives this very insinuating speech where he doesn't exactly say that the three of them are involved in a menage a trois, but he all but says it, right? He says, what is going on here between these men? What does Cohn have on McCarthy? What does McCarthy have on Cohn? What is this peculiar relationship between these three? And again, it's hinted at in the newspapers. And then you have the very famous moment from the hearings itself when, we're all familiar with the moment where the Army lawyer, a man named Joseph Welch, says to Joe McCarthy, "Have you no decency, sir?"
Right.
And that was really the moment when sort of the opposition to McCarthy, crystallized. And that was really his downfall. But earlier in the hearings, Joseph Welch referred to Roy Cohn as a fairy on national television. These hearings were watched by more than half the country. Mm-hmm. And there was a conversation about a photograph that had been entered into evidence. And Welch was asking where this photograph emerged from. He said something. He said, was it a pixie who entered it into evidence? And Joe McCarthy asked, "What's a pixie?" And Joseph Welch replied, "A pixie is a close relative of a fairy." And he didn't need to explain what he was saying. Everyone in the room knew what he was referring to. He was referring to Roy Cohn and his mysterious relationship with David Schein. So yes, there was a lot of scuttlebutt about McCarthy being potentially gay. He married his secretary late in his 40s. He got married, I think, at 47 or 48 years old. They adopted a baby. So all this sort of added, evidence to the claim that McCarthy himself perhaps was gay, but there's no definitive evidence of that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I like that, or the lens by which your book examines a lot of this is a sort of presidential history from FDR to Bill Clinton, mm-hmm. which I think is very important. It's history of the 20th century, basically, or the majority of the 20th century. And there's a key figure, because the reason I bring this up is talking about Roosevelt, of course, overlaps with World War II, but the story of Sumner Wells begins in 1940 or happens in 1940. Mm-hmm. World War II is on. The United States is not in it yet. This is pre-Cold War, obviously, and there is a very New England Brahmin type Undersecretary of State for Roosevelt who gets implicated in apparently hitting on railroad porters. Can you talk about why you highlight Sumner Wells and that whole FDR era, and is that a sort of glide path toward opening up the larger discussion for you about how all presidents had these key aides, almost everyone who were were gay, in many cases in the closet?
Well, I start with the Wells story because that's the first gay scandal, really, in American politics. And again, it's very much related to this issue of World War II and national security, which is Sumner Wells, who's a very distinguished WASP State Department official, like practically all of them at that time. He was a second cousin of the Roosevelts, I believe. You mean he
wasn't Jewish? No, I'm joking.
He was not Jewish, but he was a strong friend of Israel.
Yes.
In fact, he was actually part of the tragedy of this story
Yeah.
is that he was actually probably the most significant voice within the Roosevelt administration urging the acceptance of more Jewish refugees from Europe. There are very few people doing that. He was one of them.
Okay.
Anyway, so he gets drunk, and many of these stories that I talk about, by the way, involve ostensibly heterosexual men getting drunk and then getting themselves into trouble.
Yeah.
He would drink too much, and then on the presidential train, he would solicit with money some of the African American porters on the train, solicit them for sexual favors. And this information gets into the hands of his arch enemy, a man named William Bullitt, who was also a very distinguished, Northeastern. He was from Pennsylvania, from one of the wealthiest families, Philadelphia families, a Yale graduate. And he was Welles's real sort of competition within the diplomatic corps. He was the first American ambassador to the Soviet Union after the United States recognized the Soviet Union in 1933. He then becomes ambassador to France during the late 1930s and the fall of France. He gets this information, and he then conspires with FDR's actual Secretary of State, a man named Cordell Hull, and they try to use this information to destroy Welles. And it's funny, FDR's initial response when he gets a dossier detailing all these salacious allegations about Welles, FDR's initial response is, well, he wasn't doing any of it on government time, was he? So he's perfectly willing to brush it off. He doesn't think that it's affecting Welles's job. But as the year progresses and America gets involved in the war, now Bullitt and Cordell Hull, they can use the blackmail justification to pressure FDR into firing Welles, which is what FDR does in 1943. He demands his resignation, and he gets it. So you see just the impact of national security, of foreign policy, of the fear of foreign adversaries getting access to secret government information. That is really what changes the U.S. government's view towards homosexuality. It's not just a social problem and a mental disorder and something that people should deal with doctors and whatnot. Now it really becomes a national security threat.
Yeah. I mean, then we move into obviously Truman, but then the Eisenhower era where the real executive order happens, right?
Yep.
The sort of beginning of this sort of lavender scare, as it's called. And then, of course, Eisenhower's successor is Kennedy, which is a really interesting chapter, not to race through the Eisenhower stuff, but it's sort of the 50s, the McCarthy era and all that stuff. But you get JFK in there, who's a serial philanderer, right? And by dint of his own kind of self awareness that he's, into his own living his personal life as he sees fit, he's weirdly, I mean, not openly, but kind of comfortable around gay men. He had gay friends in high school and had no problem with them, sort of saw them, as sort of comrades in an interesting way. Talk about the whole Kennedy era relationship, of course, Jackie Kennedy, and how that, I mean, obviously it's only a 3-year period, but it almost seems like an aberration in a way, because, then you have Johnson and Nixon and all this homophobia that come eventually Reagan, not making JFK to be the lambda champion or something, but it was interesting,
Well, there is a sort of patrician tolerance of it. You see it with FDR and his dealings with Welles.
Yeah.
You see it with JFK, whose best friend at Choate, the boarding school, was a gay man named Lem Billings, and remained his best friend throughout the rest of his life. Actually had a room at the White House, had his own bedroom at the White House. That's how close he was to JFK. And there were other gay men in the Kennedy orbit. I think most famously was Gore Vidal, who was related to Jackie through a stepfather. There was Joe Alsop, who was closeted, but who was a very famous newspaper columnist who was closeted, but sort of everyone kind of implicitly knew he was gay. JFK certainly knew he was gay, and he was a very close advisor and friend to John F. Kennedy. Truman Capote was very good friends with Jackie when she was living in New York. There was a guy named William Walton, who was the arts advisor and knew John F. Kennedy since he was a young congressman, and they were neighbors in Georgetown. And yes, JFK had his own sexually unorthodox life right? And I think that made him more sympathetic to other men who had sexually unorthodox lives. And if you were a gay man, your life was certainly sexually unorthodox in terms of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so while there was no, change or improvement in government policy towards gay people, they were still being expelled from the government, from government jobs. They were prohibited from working in the government. There, it's not as if the oppression lightened up. Personally, the Kennedys were just more tolerant. This tolerance didn't extend to Robert Kennedy, who made many homophobic remarks off the record that we know about, that I read about in the book. And that might have had something to do with his relationship with Roy Cohn. Let's not forget, Robert F. Kennedy got his start in Washington on the staff of Joe McCarthy.
Right.
Joe McCarthy was a very close friend of the Kennedy family.
Yep.
Despite the fact that they were from different political parties, there was a strong Irish Catholic connection there. Joe McCarthy was actually credited with helping John F. Kennedy win his Senate race in 1956 by not campaigning for the Republican candidate in Massachusetts. He abstained at the request of Joe Kennedy, the father. And so, Robert Kennedy got his start on Joe McCarthy's staff, where he was working under Roy Cohn. And, I can imagine if Roy Cohn is like the only gay person or is the gay person that the best, and this is a time when, there are very few gay people who are sort of out and about, that might make you a homophobe, right? So maybe that's just me psychoanalyzing Robert F. Kennedy. Maybe that's why he had a different attitude towards gay men than John F. Kennedy, whose closest friend was gay. So that's just me speculating that might have been the reason why the Kennedy brothers had a different attitude towards gay people.
The Lyndon Johnson, the two key people you highlighted, the Johnson era, Bob Waldron and then Walter Jenkins, I thought was a really interesting part of presidential history vis-a-vis gay panic, which certainly has been in our own time, was used by W. Bush in 2004. It was obviously demagogued by Reagan. It was, quite frankly, used as we're traditional values people by Hillary and Barack Obama. But it's interesting to see his close aide Waldron, who gets caught in the YMCA with a guy, but then Walter Jenkins, his chief aide, who gets in real trouble. Or Jenkins is at the YMCA, I believe it was. That was me. Yeah. But Jenkins, this happens 3 weeks before Johnson faces off to Goldwater, which of course he wins in a whopping landslide, and polls had shown that he would, and it becomes a real source of fear and panic in the Johnson White House. Talk about the whole LBJ thing, because then you started by talking about the 1960 Democratic Convention, when a Johnson aide, I don't know if you ever reveal who it was, is speaking to Theodore White, is that right? About
Ted White, yes.
Ted White. Yeah. And says, the Kennedy brothers are fags,
Right. Which is very hard to believe. If there's two people in Washington at the time who I would suspect of being gay, it would not be, certainly not be John F. Kennedy, and it would not have been Robert F. Kennedy either.
Right. And by the way, for listeners, we're both gay men. I'm using the language that was routinely used in American life and American politics from the beginning. So we're not, just, I hate trigger warnings, but I don't want anybody freaking out. We're just using as it was spoken.
Yes.
So anyway, but let's delve into LBJ. He's a good old boy. He's a former segregationist from Texas Hill Country, becomes the kind of unlikely civil rights hero, but's got these close gay men that he never certainly treats Waldron like a son, and they never really grapples with.
I just think, again, whereas for JFK, it was something that he grew up with, that he was understanding of. Certainly, if you were studying the classics, as you would at Choate and Harvard, like John F. Kennedy did, you'd be aware of homosexuality. You'd know that it existed in ancient societies and civilizations. Right. And you might consider it a moral or a sickness, like the vast majority of people did at the time, but it wouldn't shock you that this was around, and that people, and he also went to an all boys boarding school in the 1930s. So we can only imagine what happened there. Right. So it just wasn't something that necessarily shocked men like FDR and JFK, but someone like Lyndon Johnson, it's a much stranger thing. And when he's confronted with this, twice, and the Walter Jenkins story is very familiar to people. It was reported it was on the front pages of all the newspapers that his closest aide was arrested for having sex with a man in the basement bathroom of the YMCA around the corner from the White House. Just a couple of weeks before that 1964 election, it becomes a huge scandal, and it's been widely written about. The story that isn't known, or was not known until I discovered it in the FBI archives, was there was another gay man who was in the Johnson orbit, whose name was Bob Waldron.
Right.
Came from Texas, who started working for LBJ when he was Senate Majority Leader in the late 1950s. Joined his staff as when he became Vice President. Traveled with him around the world. Basically became what's known in the political world as the body man, which is, if you remember Reggie Love, who was Barack Obama's guy. He just follows the politician around wherever he goes, has a bag, full of pens and papers and breath mints and whatever that the politician needs, the body man has. And he's the guy who just basically is the valet, right? And that's what Bob Waldron was. He was also a stenographer for LBJ, and he was the best stenographer in Washington. He could take down dictation faster than anybody. And in fact, there's a story that was told about him that he told himself that I found in the LBJ Oral History Archive, where he's sitting in the closet, literally, at that 1960 Democratic Convention when RFK is trying to hash out with LBJ whether or not LBJ will be on the ticket as vice president. Waldron is in the closet taking notes in the hotel room at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. So he's very close to LBJ. But what happens is when LBJ is transitioning to become president after the assassination, there is a FBI investigation into Waldron because he wants to bring him onto his staff, and you have to go through a security background check. And in this process, they discover that Waldron is gay. They interview dozens of people throughout his life, former neighbors, former teachers, landlords, all sorts of associates, right? And they find one man who tells a story about they shared a bed together and Waldron made a pass at him. And that's enough to destroy this man's career. And LBJ basically, drops him. And it's a very tragic story. But it's very representative of many, I would say, countless stories. And it just goes to show you that even someone as close to a president as Bob Waldron was, as dependable, as loyal, that one accusation of homosexuality could destroy a political career.
Yeah. I mean, what's so interesting is that, as the book moves into the 70s and you have Nixon Ford and then Carter and all that. But, what we saw in American politics in the 70s is sort of as soon as the Phyllis Schlafly's of the world and the sort of moral majority, even before Reagan, come into the picture, the culture wars emerge, abortion, ERA, gay rights, all of that kind of comes under a certain heading. And it's interesting to watch the way that, other presidents from Roosevelt and Eisenhower and certainly Johnson and Kennedy, there's this pre-culture war. There was no real way to deal with how people viewed. They saw homosexuality as either a sin or a sickness. There was no meaningful gay rights movement really to make gay rights a formidable issue in the way it would become. And it's interesting to watch by the time Reagan comes in, you know what I mean? And of course that becomes the era of AIDS. You see the culmination of all this culture war, all this existential culture war panic becomes so woven into the political landscape to the point that, and I know this story offhand, and we're going to talk about Reagan in a second, that Nancy Reagan, obviously the Reagans came from Hollywood and they had a lot of Hollywood friends. And I don't know who it was, but I have this story that was told to me when I was working on Capitol Hill many years ago, that Reagan, someone from Hollywood said, AIDS had just come out and you have to say something about this. You know, you've had gay friends. Something has to be said. Something has to be done. And Nancy Reagan said, nope, we're not here to do that. That's not on our agenda. We're here. Ronnie's got tax cuts and communism. We're not dealing with it. It was, you know, it's just an interesting anecdotal story, but it, you know, I believe it to be true that there was, you know, such a dereliction on the part of Reagan in this area, to the point that when Rock Hudson died, you write about in the book, he scratched out profoundly next to the word saddened. But talk about, as we move, you know, closer to the Reagan era, how the sort of landscape for gay people post Stonewall changed as it related to the presidency, the larger culture. I think that's really interesting part of the book, because it is different from 1940.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, what happens in the 1970s is that homosexuality really becomes politicized.
Right.
And by that, I mean, it really becomes a political issue.
Yeah.
And more of a left-right political issue.
Yeah.
In a way that prior to that, gay people had no political allies, right? No. I mean, it didn't matter if you were liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican, they were all anti-gay. And what happens is, because of the rising importance sort of identity issues, the civil rights movement for African Americans, the women's rights movement, and the gay movement basically become liberal causes.
Right.
And the left side of the political spectrum picks up these identity-based causes. Not, you know, it's not like they're widely endorsed by members of Congress. You know, it's still, but you have people like Bella Abzug. You know, she introduces the first anti-discrimination bill in 1974, a very famous, fiery New York Jewish liberal feminist. And then you have the backlash to it, right, which comes in the form of the religious right. You have Anita Bryant, the Florida Citrus Commission spokeswoman, who launches the Save Our Children campaign, which is in response to all these anti-discrimination measures that have been passed by certain municipalities across the country. And so you have homosexuality now, really for the first time, is becoming embraced by the left, by the political left, and it's being opposed by this new right. At the same time, someone like Reagan is complicated, right? Because, you know, as you mentioned, he has gay friends, and in 1978, there's a measure called the Briggs Initiative, which would have banned gay people from teaching in public schools.
Right.
And Anita Bryant goes to California to campaign for it, and the polls are showing that this is going to win by a 2-to-1 majority. And what really changes it is that Ronald Reagan, who at that point is the popular former 2-term governor of California, who's prepared, who had run for president in the, he had challenged Gerald Ford from the right in 1976 on issues like the Panama Canal Treaty and détente, mostly foreign policy issues. But he's getting the support of the Christian right. And he's preparing his next run in 1980. In the middle of this, Ronald Reagan decides to come out against the Briggs Initiative. And he does so on libertarian grounds.
Right.
He says that this is going to cause all sorts of havoc and anarchy in the schools. You're going to have students making accusations against their teachers that they're homosexual. It's going to drive up, you know, legal fees, and the administrative bureaucracy is going to take over. And this is a private matter. And we already have, you know, regulations about preventing people from indoctrinating students. And this is not something that we need a new law for. And it's interesting, you know, Reagan is persuaded to do this by a man who you might know named David Mixner, who was
later a Clinton guy, Bill Clinton guy.
He was an anti-war. He was a very left-wing anti-Vietnam War activist and early gay rights activist. And he has the ingenious idea, and I think it's very appropriate for this show, where you talk about moderation and the importance of reaching across the political divide.
Yeah.
David Mixner knows that, you know, he needs to convince the conservatives and independents in the state of California not to vote for this measure. That it's easy to get the progressives and the liberals in San Francisco. They're already on our side. We need to convince the conservatives and the independents of the state of California that this law is punitive, that it's discriminatory, that it's unfair, that it's unnecessary, and we need someone who's going to be able to convince them of this. And he thinks, let's get Ronald Reagan to do it, right? This conservative, popular guy. And he had an inkling that Reagan might sympathize with him solely because he had been in Hollywood, and he knew that Reagan had gay friends, and he knew that he had a libertarian streak. And so he's able to get a meeting with Reagan because there's a gay man on Reagan's staff at the time. His name is Peter Hannaford, who was basically one of Reagan's closest advisors. He worked for him when he was governor, and at the time he was working with Michael Deaver, who would go on to become the chief of chief of staff in the White House, or sorry, the council, senior counselor in the White House. The two of them are basically running Ronald Reagan's exploratory presidential campaign. They're writing his op-eds, they're arranging his radio deliveries, they're organizing all his speeches across the country. Peter Hannaford is a closeted gay man. And David Mixner is able to persuade Hannaford to get him a meeting with Reagan. And he gets him a meeting, and he sits down and he makes the case to Reagan, this is why you got to oppose the Briggs Initiative. And he leaves that meeting not knowing where Reagan's going to come down. And then a week before the vote, Reagan comes out against it. He writes a newspaper column, and in his sort of trademark humorous way, he tells an anecdote about a voter who wrote to him about this and said, well, if my teachers were able to influence me so much, then I'd have turned out as a nun, right? Because I went to Catholic, this person went to Catholic school. So he comes out against the law, and then this measure for where the support for it had been 2-1 in favor, it ends up losing 2-1 again. So Reagan's intervention here completely flips it. And there's a lot of, I think, misunderstood history about this. Harvey Milk is really credited with defeating the Briggs Initiative. If you see the movie Milk, that's sort of the narrative. It's totally not true. Harvey Milk had no influence outside San Francisco. Harvey Milk was not convincing, remember, California used to be a red state, okay?
Oh, yeah.
So, Harvey Milk
was Nixon and Reagan.
Nixon and Reagan. So Harvey Milk was not convincing anyone outside of San Francisco not to vote for the Briggs Initiative, as is portrayed in that movie. It was Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, he plays a very important role here in the history of gay rights, actually, in stopping what would have been a terrible law. This would have been a terrible, terrible law, right? Banning gay. It would have been a McCarthyite purge of gay people from the public schools. It was built upon this. Really, I mean, the worst thing you can say about gay men is that they're pedophiles,
right?
And that's the fear that this law was taking advantage of and exploiting. And Reagan, I'm not going to say he single-handedly defeated it, because obviously there were a lot of people involved in that No on 6 campaign, and David Mixner was one of them. But Reagan's intervention was crucial. And you can ask David Mixner today; he's still alive, and I interviewed him for my book. He says if Reagan had not come out against that measure, then it would have passed, right? So, but then Reagan becomes president in 1980, and as you said, his behavior on AIDS was not optimal. And I actually attribute it to something, again, that's a revelation in my book, which is that there were these rumors that Reagan was being surrounded by a homosexual cabal since his earliest days in Sacramento, in Hollywood. And there were maybe even a fear that Reagan himself could be gay. And there's this scandal that I uncovered in 1980. It was never written about, but it was a group of Republican congressmen, including Dick Cheney. It was a group of liberal to moderate Republican congressmen. And it might be hard for people to imagine this, but Dick Cheney was the chief of staff for Gerald Ford.
Sure, who was probably. Would you agree? I think that Gerald Ford. I mean, based on I don't know all the public pronouncements. We know there was that book that came out after he died, which expressed all his sentiments. But he and Betty were basically kind of pro-choice, pro-gay, ERA Republicans in those days.
Yeah. And Dick Cheney had some resentment towards Ronald Reagan, and Dick Cheney was considered a moderate Republican at the time.
Sure.
And there was this group of liberal to moderate Republican congressmen who tried to get the Washington Post to launch an investigation into what they claimed was a right-wing, gay, anti-communist cabal that was manipulating Ronald Reagan as if he were a Manchurian candidate.
Right.
And this dated back to the first year of Reagan's governorship, where there actually was a gay scandal. There was an allegation that a group of Reagan aides had participated in an all-male orgy at a vacation timeshare in Lake Tahoe. And Reagan actually had to fire 2 of his aides over this. And this never sort of went away. And this suspicion that Reagan, because he was a Hollywood guy, he was an actor, he was friends with Rock Hudson, there was this scandal when he was governor, And it all kind of came to a head in the summer of 1980, just before the convention. Um, and I discovered this investigation in the papers of Ben Bradley, who was the legendary
Washington Post.
editor of the Washington Post from the mid 1960s onwards. He led the Post through the Pentagon Papers case, Watergate. Right. And he's presented with a dossier of information allegedly, indicting the Reagan campaign of being infested with homosexuals. And he puts his best reporters on this, including Bob Woodward, and they fan out and they interview people and they report it out. And the Post never printed anything, but I found all the notes from the investigation in Ben Bradley's papers, and I tell the story. It's a wild, crazy story that the Post took very seriously. I mean, they didn't brush it off. They investigated it, and they ultimately discovered that, yes, there were gay men working for Ronald Reagan, but there was no evidence that, well, really what led them not to publish it was that the individuals involved were not going to be receiving jobs with security clearances. And one of the men who was implicated in this, as I mentioned, was Pete Hannaford. And Peter Hannaford did not go into the Reagan administration, and it may have been because of this. It may have been because of the understanding or the fear, because the Reagan people, they knew he was gay by this point because this was brought to their attention. It was brought to Ed Meese's attention that there were these accusations that Peter Hannaford was gay, and that might have I don't have the Ed Meese denied this when I called him up for an interview. But this may have been the reason why Peter Hannaford did not get a job in the Reagan White House, because he knew that he would never be able to pass the security clearance.
To your point about a complicated legacy, of course, Reagan was not a churchgoer. He signed liberal abortion laws in California as governor.
Yep.
He had been divorced also, like a former president, not three times.
First divorced president. Yeah.
Right. First divorced president. I think he was born a Presbyterian or something in Tampico, Illinois, but it was a sort of very moderate Midwestern ecumenical kind of Christianity he was raised in, I believe. To my memory, one of the things I read many years ago, and I was looking for it before this interview, we can find it, is that William Safire, he might have written it in the New York Times, or it might have been in a book, spoke about how the Reagan White House treated the religious right when it came. And a lot of this he was referring more to abortion rights and school prayer, the constitutional amendment for school prayer and all this stuff, and they had really cemented their support, but kind of had to now deal with them. They had overtaken the party, which to many in the party's chagrin. And basically the Reagan White House's view of the moral majority in all these issues, right? This is not to say that he should be exonerated for his policies on AIDS, but it's to say that they famously said, I don't know if it was Reagan himself or a Reagan aide said, about the religious right, we will jolly them along. I don't know if you know that story. And it was a open secret, that we would make all the overtures about an abortion ban and a school prayer amendment, none of which they would ever follow through. As a matter of fact, Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor precisely because she was a moderate, not only because she's a woman, but he wanted somebody that wasn't, probably he thought conformed more to a kind of libertarian. She was Arizona, the Goldwater kind of world of his view. So it's interesting, I'm just putting a little cherry on your story to say that, sometimes these things have now been viewed through a presentist lens of, mainly leftist lens that says that anything that ever happened that was good in America was only because of anybody who was ever a Democrat or to the left of that. And the Republicans have contributed absolutely nothing, not civil rights, not the end of slavery, that kind of thing. So it's a fascinating thing. As the book goes on, though, we end with Bill Clinton, another complicated person who, of course, I believe his convention speech is the first time when he says all Americans are welcome, Jewish, Gentile, straight, or gay. I don't think anyone had ever said that before. He obviously originally said he was just going to completely lift the ban on the military, got all this blowback, and end up with don't ask, don't tell. And then famously in 1996, though, he was going to cruise to re-election against Bob Dole, under cover of the night, pretty much signed the deplorable Defense of Marriage Act. But again, he, in 1995, lifted the executive he allowed for executive clearances finally of openly gay people in the government. Talk about speaking of a complicated legacy, Bill Clinton.
I think if you look at in isolation, the Clinton administration, it comes off badly on gay rights. And again, because of that presentist bias that you talk about, when you talk to most people about the Clinton administration and gays, you hear the same bad things. Don't ask, don't tell, the Defense of Marriage Act. And I'm not trying, and I'm not an apologist for the Clintons here, but I think if you look at the grand sweep of history, the Clinton administration was extremely important in terms of gay rights. Because
by the way, I'm a huge Bill Clinton fan as presidency, so this is just to sort of nuance it a little bit.
It's the first administration to not just not attack and purge gay people, but to welcome them in. Sure. Bill Clinton becomes the first major party presidential candidate in 1992 to officially reach out to the gay community. That had never happened before. No Democratic or Republican candidate had ever explicitly reached out to the gay community. He does that with a speech in May 1992 in Los Angeles. It's a historic speech. It's on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times, because he's actually addressing a room full of gay people. And he says, I have a vision of America and I want you to be a part of it. And then at the convention, and then he becomes president. And what does he do? He actually starts recruiting gay people. There's actually a little office where it's in collaboration with the Human Rights Campaign, the major gay rights group, and they actually try to recruit openly gay people to work to staff the administration. Right? That had never happened before. It's same for women too, by the way. Right? I mean, up until Clinton, every president since FDR had maybe had one woman in the cabinet, the token woman, usually in Health and Human Services or HUD. Right? Like usually in something where you would want a woman to be, right? In the hospital or in the home. Bill Clinton has all these women. He's got Janet Reno, the first woman attorney general. He's got Madeleine Albright, the first woman secretary of state. There are lots of other women throughout in leadership positions. 1992, I believe, was also the year of the woman in Congress. And you have all these women being elected. The highest number of women ever elected to the House and Senate in history. So, the 90s are a really important era for inclusion of historically oppressed and marginalized people at the highest reaches of the American government. And then in 1995, as you say, and this is where I decided to end the book, is with Bill Clinton lifting the ban on gay people getting security clearances. Because that really is what the book started with, gay people being purged because of this fear that they represented a threat to national security. And then with Bill Clinton, you have gay people finally being welcomed into the CIA, the NSA, the other top secret security institutions. So I'm trying to sort of revise that understanding of the Clinton administration. It's warts and all.
Sure.
But when people ask me, why do I end the book where I did, I ended it there, because this is really a book about the relationship between gay people and the national security state. And it starts with World War II and it ends with the end of the Cold War, right? Bill Clinton wouldn't have been able to lift that ban on security clearances, I don't think, had not the Cold War ended a couple of years earlier, right? And so we have this peace dividend where it's a much more optimistic time. We're building a bridge to the 21st century. We can invest in all these other things. We don't have to spend so much money on defense anymore. Russia is a collapsing empire. They're no longer the evil empire. And so that creates the political room. And also the fact that gay people themselves had made such huge strides.
Right. Yeah.
In public life, right? Gay people, they're coming out to their families, their friends, celebrities in the workplace. Americans are less afraid of gay people. They're less opposed to equal rights for gay people than they were in the 1980s. Then never mind the 1940s and 30s when the book begins.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the other thing that should be noted, which just happened to coincide and overlap with the Clinton presidency, was Will and Grace, the network show.
Yes, yeah.
Very important. If some people say culture is downstream of politics. Other people say politics is downstream of culture. I go back and forth, but there was certainly a huge impact to a president who was largely friendly to the gay community, and a TV show that could be number one in markets like Kansas City and Indianapolis.
Absolutely.
So I think that was an interesting cultural political nexus. To today, not just in the world of where we are in terms of progress and justice. We are in. You mentioned this podcast trying to connect conservatives and independents. I'm a real mutt politically, proudly. I probably am very much a limited government guy. I probably at one point could have been a Rockefeller Republican. I don't know. I don't want to be on either of these teams. I was born and raised a Democrat. I worked for Bob Graham, senator from Florida, who I like a lot because I think he was kind of maybe a blue dog Democrat. We are in a very illiberal time in a lot of ways. I think that, so I want to get your take on this, that sort of illiberalism is they're sort of coming from two different places. I argue that the right and MAGA represent a dire and existential threat to democracy. Okay. But I think that asymmetrically, but I do think that the growing chorus, and I don't know how large or small they are because it's hard to know, of a certain anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic left identity politics crowd, anti-free speech crowd. I know you're a big free speech absolutist. I think, though, there's an asymmetrical situation here, but they're a threat to democracy. I think we're really facing these kind of twin threats, which isn't unusual. We face communism and fascism in the 20th century. It's not like the left has no authoritarian impulses. What do you think about the current climate in general, about our politics? Is Trump the end of America if he gets back in power, or I don't know. I just want to hear your overview.
Well, he was president for 4 years, in case people forget, and this country survived.
Yeah.
And we survived because of our institutions, and our institutions stood up, and they were strong enough, even against someone like Donald Trump. And so while I am, a strong opponent of Donald Trump, I will not be voting for him under any circumstances. I've been a very loud critic of his.
Yes, me too.
I also think that there's more than a bit of hysteria surrounding him. There really isn't, if you actually think about it. There's not an example of an established democracy becoming a fascist dictatorship, or becoming or a fascist democracy. Right. Sorry, an established democracy collapsing and becoming some sort of dictatorship. That's never happened. Right. Weimar Germany was not an established democracy. It was a young.
Can I interject here? I just was having it was sort of, cordial argument with somebody the other day, and the thing that's driving me crazy is, well, there's of course Godwin's law, which everything ends up being about Hitler, but everybody keeps making these really historically fallacious analogies that, this is not Germany in 1933. No. So your point, at all, or 1928 even,
Spain in the 1930s was not an established democracy right before Franco. No. So there's actually no historical examples of this ever happening in the modern era. So we have all these so-called historians and political experts running around, and all these books, they sell millions of copies, and you turn on MSNBC and it's just nonstop people saying that Trump's going to single-handedly turn this country into a dictatorship. There's no historical basis for this.
Right.
And I'm not saying that bad things can't happen. Something unpredictable could happen if he were president. But what is the step-by-step process of how he's going to turn this country into a dictatorship? The first thing you have to do is you have to take over the media. Is he going to do that? The military, presumably you would need the support of the military to impose this, fascist theocratic dictatorship. I don't know if anyone's checked, but the military really opposed Donald Trump when he was president. Look at the Joint Chiefs.
Of course. Okay,
look at the way that they responded to him whenever he wanted to back out of NATO or anything like that. So, look at this. Also, if you want to turn America into a dictatorship, you also need the help of your security services. Yes. Your FBI and your CIA. Are the FBI and the CIA pro Donald Trump? The FBI, I would actually say, intervened inappropriately against Donald Trump during his presidency, as did, John Brennan at the CIA as well. So the notion that these institutions if they're misbehaving, they're misbehaving against Donald Trump, I would actually argue. So I'm just not, and that's not even to get into all the other institutions that are opposed to Donald Trump. So I just don't understand. Hitler had the support of all those institutions, and he was able to take them over. I don't see how Donald Trump pulls that off, particularly in a federal republic like the United States, where so many powers are reserved to the states, to governors. I just think that Donald Trump is a threat to many things in many different ways, but this notion, this nightmare scenario that he turns America into a dictatorship and that our democracy is going to end, I actually think that that's being used to suppress democracy, right? These attempts to get Donald Trump off the ballot by people who claim to be such great Democrats, that worries me. The attempt to censor political speech, kicking him off of Twitter, all this stuff. It's all these people doing this in the name of democracy.
Right.
That to me seems really hypocritical. If you support democracy, you don't take your opponent off the ballot. You don't censor his political speech.
Right.
You don't try.
By the way, the other thing too, which is really, I think, needs to be said, which I also think has been, it's been hyperbole that has done a great disservice, and I'm not going to single out the perpetrators. There are many of them. Donald Trump is a greedy man. Donald Trump loves power. He loves money, and he wants a high-rise, a Ritz-Carlton in downtown Moscow. That is not the same thing, and this does not minimize Russian interference, of him being a Russian spy or a Kremlin.
Absolutely.
I find that, and no one has ever convincingly convinced me otherwise. Now, that does not mean that there wasn't a why was, what's his name, Kalimnik or whatever, talking to a Hillary person in England or something. He was also an FBI informant, that guy too. So yes. Yeah, what I mean is, but they keep saying this thing, and it's like, I know that's been hard. I'm not, again, maybe there wasn't collusion. There's a relationship clearly, and the Senate Intelligence Committee, Republican led, said Russia interfered in the election. I'm not disputing it, but this turning Donald Trump into, Putin's exact puppet, it just feels like DNC agitprop to me, and certainly MSNBC agitprop, you might say.
It's an alibi for people who don't want to grapple with the real reasons why this man has support, why he won and has support. Right. Obviously, for the Clinton campaign, it's pure self-interest, right? Neither she nor her supporters want to accept their own faults, right? That, Robbie Mook was a terrible campaign manager.
Right.
So rather than him admit that, and rather than her admit that she was a terrible candidate.
Right.
Oh, it's the Russians. Yeah, Vladimir Putin. He spent $100,000 on Facebook ads and did some other things, and that's how this guy became president of the United States. I mean, it's ridiculous. And it's a way of avoiding confronting the real problems. And I think we see it again now I feel like, Democrats, and not all Democrats, but a lot of Democrats and a lot of liberals have learned nothing. Where you look at an issue like immigration and they just say, well, anyone who opposes us on immigration is a racist.
Right, of course.
Well, if people are racist, and there's no real way of convincing them otherwise, right? If they just hate Hispanic people and they hate foreigners, then there's really it's just a waste of our time trying to convince them. So rather than actually grapple with the real issues that are presented with having a border crisis, and it is a crisis, okay? It is a crisis, and it is causing strain on our services. Rather than deal with all that stuff, it's just easier and more comforting to accuse your opponents of being, Russian bots or racists or xenophobes or whatever, and it saves you from doing the hard work of actually trying to win elections.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think I quipped this sometime after October 7th. I'm really excited for the Democrats to label all the Republicans Nazis in 2024 when rabidly open anti-Semitic people, roam the halls and can barely get the full condemnation of their entire governing body, but we'll hear about every Nazi on the right, when actually one of the things that's emerged, a shift to discussion of anti-Semitism, by the way, post October 7th, and now I've written 2 pieces about it, is number one, speaking of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was the chief sponsor of the PLO and a lot of the propaganda that came, anti-Israel propaganda that came out in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So that's number one. I mean, there is speaking of a Russia connection. But number two, the idea that, that there is no institutional anti-Semitism in the realm of the media and academia and entertainment industry, which really you could argue have, I'd say, inherently more power than other institutions. It's a fascinating argument, which is to say that, yeah, there are neo-Nazis marching. There are far-right lunatics who I think are a bunch of disorganized thugs. I think that this sort of dedicated I think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but let's just call it anti-Zionism, and the entire left's capitulation to this insane accommodation for a barbaric terrorist organization and their allies. I sit there and I go, it's amazing the way this has been mainlined into our veins to be, you know what I mean? To say, well, I mean, what about Marjorie Taylor Greene? It's like, well, hold on. Both things can be true, right? Both sidesism is also a sort of fallacy too, because it doesn't mean that you can't have two things be true at the same time and they have different import,
I mean, who has more power in America? The ragtag group of thugs at Charlottesville,
right?
Or the American professoriate,
right.
I think the American professoriate has a lot more, maybe not political power, but certainly influence, because they're churning out every year, generations of young people who are inculcated in terrible, crazy beliefs. One of them being anti-Semitism.
Of course.
And it's happening at our elite schools across the country. So, as an American Jew, and never mind being a Jew, as someone who's concerned about preserving a liberal, small L liberal society, I think that our professors in this country, not all of them, obviously, but the professoriate at our elite institutions in the humanities largely are one of the most poisonous influences in the United States. Americans looked at what happened on October 8th. They looked at these elite institutions where you had students celebrating this massacre and cheering on slaughter. And I think the vast majority of Americans were outraged at this and disgusted by it and wanted to know, how did this happen? And the answer is the professors.
Yeah.
It's the professors and the DEI administrators. It's those groups of people, and they have enormous influence over our future generations, far more so than, the schmucks who showed up at Charlottesville, they're despicable, knuckle-dragging thugs. Okay? Right. I hold no quarter for them. But as an American Jew, who went to Yale, who is part of these institutions, who considers himself part of the intellectual world, I'm much more troubled by what I see, in the academy, in mainstream media, in the nonprofit sector, in the arts community. Those institutions are sense-making institutions, our media, right? Those institutions are infected with this anti-Semitic virus, and that to me is more concerning than the fact that there are some knuckle-dragging Nazis, which every society has those and always will.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things that have come out of the university system that have been really rotten theoretically. One is this sort of buffing off to a very polished sheen, the idea of credible Marxism historically, which I just think is taught not from a point of view. It's important to read it. I've read a lot of it. I studied it, but it's just taught as some kind of credible alternative to our world, and I think that's false and dangerous. But the other thing is that the reductionist view of race, creating this ridiculous binary, deciding who's white and who's in the oppression Olympics, Jews being white, therefore being oppressors, tying it all into what I believe to be bunk, also known as post-colonial theories, largely bunk, and the rejection of Enlightenment principles. The Enlightenment, contrary to what a lot of the professors will teach you or the left seems to think, was actually not Eurocentric. It was actually an antidote to a kind of colonialist view of the world. It was a way of universalizing principles that had not been part of any discourse ever, that have animated our dialogue in the last 400 years. And so, again, having it all conflated together as some form of catastrophic evil or menace, I think has been very destructive. And again, those are my opinions, and I'm a student of all of it. And I find it so historically inaccurate and so preposterous sometimes, and it's given real mainstream credibility because it comes from the professoriate and then it's repeated on the nightly news shows, as if these are viable. Not, I believe free speech. I want to hear every anti-Semite and every Marxist out there, but to give it the kind of credence that it shouldn't have, I find very fascinating. It's just my view.
Well, it was. I'm paraphrasing George Orwell, who said that there are some ideas that are so preposterous that only intellectuals could support them.
Right. So Jamie, in writing this book and in doing the work, you've done and written about extensively on everything, what would you say, to sort of finish here, would be the lane? Because I think you're a dirty moderate, okay? Like I am. I really do. I mean, as a compliment. What's the lane for us? I'm politically homeless. I say that all the time. It's no fun, but I got to do me. Are we going to just be nomads for a while? Do you think that there will be a kind of, renewed Republican Party of, or the Democrats going to go hard left post Biden? What do you think? Where do we go? Not that we're exactly the same, but we're kind of brothers in arms in a way.
No, I mean, I'm concerned because a lot of the good people are leaving. I don't know if you're familiar with a congressman who's about my age. I think he's 40, Mike Gallagher.
Sure, I know Mike. From Wisconsin, right?
Wisconsin, who's a Republican, who's
good guy.
He's a veteran. I know him. He's a great guy. He's a smart, serious person. Probably the most serious, China hawk. In Congress, and he's retiring, and that's sad because he's someone who I think would be a great leader for our country. Look, there are other people on both sides of the aisle who I respect and admire. I mentioned one Republican. I'm going to mention a Democrat, Richie Torres, the Democrat from New York.
Great.
Who's a young Afro Latino. Former city councilor from the Bronx, who's a strong supporter of the Jewish community and the state of Israel, and a real, left-wing progressive on lots of other issues, certainly. But he's someone who I think is, open to debate and open to hearing other perspectives. And there's just so few of them. I can list them, I feel like, on one hand, unfortunately. And so, I don't know if it's a structural problem in our country, because I feel like I agree with you. I think most Americans are actually in this middle ground. I think they are independents of some form or another. They're not partisan progressives or partisan conservatives. They're a hodgepodge of different views, and it's difficult to see that expressed in Congress. I do think, fortunately, I think our media we're seeing more diverse voices. With the rise of Substack and podcasts, and guys like Bill Maher, I think are doing fascinating, great things and bringing people together. There's lots of initiatives that are doing that, and I think the American people are better than their leaders. is what I'll say. I don't think that we are, as a people, represented very well by the people who represent us.
No, alas, I agree with you. Folks, Jamie Kirchick, there's so much more to say. We're going to have you back and talk more, but I do, for those that many of you have already probably read this, but given that I just did, it's his book, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington, New York Times bestseller, a phenomenal read, and a serious history, by the way. There's a lot of nuggets and gossip and scuttlebutt in there, but this is a serious history, American social and political history from FDR to Bill Clinton. So definitely read it. Also, you can find Jamie's writings a lot of places, from, like I said, Tablet to Airmail to The Atlantic, to the New York Times. Google him. And Jamie, where can people find you on the socials? Where do we follow you? And tell us.
Well, I have a website, jameskirchick.com. I also have a very inactive Twitter account.
Okay.
Just J Kirchick, my last name. But if you go to my website, you can sign up for my email list where I send out my articles, or Twitter. Twitter, I usually post what I'm doing there, my TV podcast appearances and the articles that I write.
All right. Well, it's been a delight to have you. Like I said, I think you're a dirty modder. We got to have you back as this election year progresses. Look, we're in it together, and we love the American experiment. We want to see it endure and survive. So thank you, folks. As always, thank you for joining us. Stay dirty, stay moderate, and stay safe.